It's early February 1945. We're in Yalta, in the Soviet Union. With the end of World War II in sight, the festivities of how to divvy up Europe were well underway. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin were all present, having discussions over the end of the war and what would come next. And during this conference, to decide the future of the world for decades to come, a small, otherwise completely banal interaction would go almost unnoticed by everyone in the building. All of these heads of state weren't just meeting each other, but also other important members of these leaders' inner circles. Generals, government officials, and diplomats all handled the negotiation in the background of the Big Three's famous talks. The story goes that on one of the days of the conference, Stalin walks up to Roosevelt with another man beside him. Small, diminutive, balding, with little circular glasses perched on the top of his nose. Stalin introduced him as the head of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police. His name was Lavrentiy Beria. Stalin proudly told Roosevelt that he was, quote, "my Himmler." That comparison is actually pretty apt. Both Himmler and Beria were heads of their state's secret police, both waved an enormous amount of power back home, and both were quiet, administrative types, fiercely loyal to their leaders. But despite the comparisons to Himmler, Beria did have something about him that was a little different. Incredibly, the comparison to Himmler actually kind of undersells just what a nasty, cunning, slippery and brutal individual Beria really was. He was responsible for thousands upon thousands of deaths in the Soviet Union. He killed with impunity, he did whatever he could to hold on to power, and he was deeply disturbed, as evidenced by some of his lesser-known crimes. And despite the comparisons to someone like Himmler, Beria is far less known today by comparison. It's almost as though he got away with it. So, who was this man really? How did he rise from the mountains of the Caucasus to become Stalin's right-hand man and the most feared individual in all of the Soviet Union? And just how much blood was really spilled in his wake? This is the story of Lavrentiy Beria, Stalin's butcher. Like all of our darker subjects, some parts have been censored to adhere to YouTube's content guidelines. For an uncensored, ad-free version, please visit our Patreon. The link is in the description. Lavrentiy Pavlovich Beria was born in 1899 in Georgia, specifically in the village of Merkuli. His father was a landowner, but the family was still poor. Not much is known about the earliest point in his life, but it's reported he went to school and showed an aptitude for education. He went to Baku in Azerbaijan to get an education at the Azerbaijan State Oil Academy. And it's here where the story around Beria gets a bit messy. Yes, even this early on. In 1917, Beria joined the Bolshevik Party in Azerbaijan, but some reports stipulate that he was part of an anti-Bolshevik group, like the Muscovat Party just before this, with some stating that this was in order to infiltrate one group to help the other in counterintelligence operations. It's really not clear where his loyalties lied, and that's a common theme for Beria. Our take is that he could see the writing on the wall with the recent Bolshevik revolution in Russia, and was carefully placing himself to side with the victor when it inevitably spilled over into Azerbaijan. Beria was cunning like that. In truth, he wasn't really much of a socialist, so it's not like he had a clear ideological preference. He was pragmatic and cynical, not particularly driven by dogma. Soon, the Red Army would invade, and Beria was captured. They didn't trust him under suspicion of being anti-Bolshevik, and were going to execute him, but at the last minute, they changed their mind. Some state that this is because the Red Army didn't have time amidst other operations, but others say it was on the orders of Stalin's friend Sergei Kirov, who was a Bolshevik official in the region at the time. Whatever happened, though, Beria's life was saved, and with this stay of execution, many others would be doomed to perish in his place. The Red Army would take over Azerbaijan and incorporate it into the fledgling Soviet Union. And before long, Beria's experience in infiltration and counterintelligence, regardless of what side he was really on, proved very useful. He ended up working for the Cheka, a catch-all term for Soviet secret police in Azerbaijan. Soon, he would see struggle in his native Georgia when the Mensheviks and Bolsheviks battled it out for the future of their nation. The Red Army and the Cheka were heavily involved, and so that meant Beria was also leading into more Soviet incorporation. He would later be made the Deputy Secretary of the Georgian Cheka, and in 1924 he would put down a Georgian nationalist uprising with brutal efficiency. 10,000 people were executed in the aftermath, and Beria was one of the key decision-makers who made it happen. Throughout the 1920s, he continued to rise up the ranks within the Soviet security apparatus, owing much of his success to his loyalty to the regime and his willingness to carry out its darkest orders, no matter what. Beria was a shapeshifter and a survivor. All things to all people, whatever it took. He would first meet Joseph Stalin when the Man of Steel himself was vacationing in the Caucasus in 1931, with Beria placed in charge of his personal security. The two men hit it off, likely owing to their shared Georgian roots. Stalin had been unimpressed with local party leaders, but he liked Beria, writing in a letter that following year, quote, "Beria makes a good impression. He's a good organizer, an efficient, capable functionary." Soon he would find out just how efficient Beria was. He continued to climb the ranks until he was appointed party leader for the whole Transcaucasian region in 1932 and was made responsible for carrying out Stalin's purges in the region without oversight. Quite unlike other regions where Stalin would personally micromanage the gruesome details. Many lost their lives at Beria's hand during this time, falsely accused, tortured, shot. Beria used his carte blanche powers to eliminate his local rivals and consolidate power. And all the while, his unwavering loyalty continued to impress Stalin. Before long, Moscow was calling. So far, everything we've told you about Beria would make you think he was just like any other loyal cog in Stalin's Soviet machine. But behind those bespectacled eyes was the cold, calculated and sinister stare of a monster, considered uniquely cruel and depraved, even at the height of the Soviet Union's purges. Under Stalin's employ back in Moscow by 1938, Beria was made the deputy head of the NKVD, and quickly got to work. He first set about ousting his boss, Nikolai Yezhov, who was the current leader of the NKVD at the time. Beria started throwing around the accusation that Yezhov was plotting to overthrow Stalin, and Stalin, who was himself neurotically paranoid at the best of times, eagerly gobbled up the story. Yezhov would meet the same fate that many others did in the Soviet Union, executed via a bullet to the head. Once Beria was put at the helm, he then set about purging the NKVD of anybody not loyal to him personally. Whilst the purges for the general public were actually eased when Beria got into power, and thousands were freed from labour camps, none of this was out of the goodness of his heart. It was a cynical ploy to garner public support, whilst simultaneously ridding the secret police of so-called enemies of the state. Of a list of 457 of these enemies, Beria had 346 of them executed. But for Beria, 346 deaths is a drop in the ocean. It was Stalin who said, "One death is a tragedy, a million is a statistic." And nobody quite encapsulated that mindset like Lavrentiy Beria did. It's unknown just how many people died directly at his hands or owing to his decisions, but it's believed to be in the tens of thousands at a conservative minimum, and many more believe that more indirectly, due to his role in the purges, it could be in the hundreds of thousands or possibly even the millions. The man himself made it quite clear he would crush anybody standing in his way. Quote, "Anyone who attempts to raise a hand against the will of our people, against the will of the party of Lenin and Stalin, will be mercilessly crushed and destroyed." And he kept that promise. In 1939, both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union invaded Poland in a brutal land grab that subjected the Polish people to some of the worst crimes of the war. The Nazis' most infamous concentration camps, like Auschwitz, were set up there, but the Soviets weren't too much better either. Warsaw simply had no chance, and after Poland was defeated, many Polish POWs would find their fate in the hands of Lavrentiy Beria. Beria sent a memo to Stalin in 1940 that such prisoners were a threat to the new Soviet regime in Poland. His solution to this problem was to put them to death. Orchestrated by Beria, 22,000 soldiers, priests, doctors, and intellectuals were brutally executed and dumped in mass graves in the Katyn forest. It was a senseless war crime, and the USSR would refuse to admit to the atrocity until 1990, half a century later. During those 50 years of silence, they would instead blame the Nazis for this wanton act of cruelty. One less tragedy, one more statistic. Stick it on the bill. But during the war and the Great Terror, Beria would continue this horror show, running a network of slave labor camps for the Soviet regime. The gulags did exist before Beria, but he was the one who industrialized them on a mass scale. Beria also ran an execution squad in Moscow, being entrusted by Stalin to orchestrate the show trials and violent executions of high-profile defendants. However, he also shot thousands of workers, peasants, and everyday people, all caught up in the regime's paranoia. Many more were arrested for any reason that could be conjured up, with Beria reportedly having said, quote, "Give me the man, and I will find the case against him." Such cases usually meant death. At Kalinin, which is a small city north of Moscow, today called Tver, Beria killed so many people himself that he wore a leather cap, apron, and long gloves to keep the blood and gore from himself and his uniform. He would round up 250 political prisoners at night, mostly Polish, and, using a German pistol, would personally execute 250 people. One bullet to the head. Again and again. And he would do it night after night after night, for a month. And that's not the end of it. Women who Beria came across would be treated worst of all, often being assaulted and forced to submit to Beria for fear of their families being targeted by the regime. His reputation around women and young girls was so feared that Stalin himself called his daughter, Svetlana, and ordered her to return home at once upon hearing that she was at Beria's house. This picture of Beria with Svetlana on his knee is just another chilling insight, barely breaking the facade of the truly evil man he was under the surface. Some of the exact details of Beria's actions towards women are too extreme to be mentioned here on YouTube, though they are available on our Patreon. But for as invincible as he seems, and as feared as he was, Lavrentiy Beria's reign of terror would eventually come to a suitably grim conclusion. This was the Soviet Union, after all. Everyone got the same treatment in the end. By 1953, Beria, as the chief of the secret police, a serial murderer, predator of young women and girls, and calculated monster, was one of the most hated men in the country. It seemed like nothing could stop him, as he whispered conspiracy after conspiracy into Stalin's paranoid ear. His seemingly unwavering loyalty to the regime had served him well. He'd got what he wanted, whenever he wanted, and all it took was a river of blood everywhere he went. But then, the Soviet world as we knew it changed. Nobody had heard from Stalin in several hours one morning, which was unusual, but people were so afraid of him that nobody wanted to go and check for fear of the dictator's wrath. Eventually, upon entering his room unannounced, whoever found Stalin, and to this day it's disputed who actually did, then called Beria. He, and soon-to-be leader of the Soviet Union, Nikita Khrushchev, went to find out just what had happened. They found Stalin unconscious, having suffered a stroke, laying in a puddle of his own urine. Theories abound that Beria, Khrushchev, and another member of Stalin's inner circle, Georgy Malenkov, might have poisoned him, but nobody knows for sure. Stalin was already in ill health and was convinced that doctors were out to get him. It may have also been that the senior officials, upon finding Stalin in such a state, actively chose not to act in order to hasten his death. Khrushchev wrote in his own memoirs that Beria spewed hatred and mockery towards Stalin as he slowly lay dying. When he showed signs of consciousness, Beria would then fall to his knees and grab the leader's hand, and when he would fall unconscious again, he spat at him. His loyalty, just like everything else, was a calculated ploy for his own benefit. But Khrushchev had skeletons in his closet too, and whilst no one liked Beria, Nikita might have had a reason to embellish just how cartoonishly evil Beria was with these kinds of stories. Whatever the case, though, within a week, on the 5th of March, Stalin was announced as deceased. And with that, everything changed. The power vacuum had now been switched on, and Beria's previous invincibility was no more. Nonetheless, for the moment, Beria appeared happy in the wake of Stalin's death, and there were rumours that the two had actually fallen out in recent times. What's more, Beria was in a strong position to succeed the Man of Steel. He was considered something of a reformer politically, with no love for pure socialist dogma. But it would be Melenkov, a supposed old ally of Beria, who would originally take the reins from Stalin as leader. Beria was made the Minister of both State Security and Internal Affairs, which put him in control of both the secret and the regular police, as well as a private army of infantry divisions. He was getting more powerful. Someone would have to do something. But the problem was, Melenkov was a weak leader, and soon Khrushchev, who was a relative outsider for the leadership, would sidestep him with political acumen, eventually taking over by 1955. But before that, he arranged a plot to put Beria down like the rabid dog he was, once and for all. Accounts about what happened vary considerably, but here's what we know for sure. Khrushchev, not yet the Soviet premier, but building his power and consolidating, orchestrated a plot to topple Beria. During a meeting at the Politburo, at this time called the Presidium, in June of 1953, Khrushchev launched a blistering attack on Beria, accusing him of being a cynical careerist, which was true, not a real communist believer, which was also true, and being a British spy, which probably wasn't true. Other veteran leaders like Molotov chimed in, criticising Beria, and soon Khrushchev called for Beria's removal. Melenkov pressed a button under his desk, which was the signal for Marshal Zhukov and his soldiers to come in and arrest Beria. He was in on it too. The hatred of fear clearly ran deep. Beria's men were actually guarding the Kremlin at the time, and because they were loyal to him, they may have tried to free their commander, leading to an all-out conflict. So the officers waited until nightfall before smuggling him into the back of a car to an underground bunker prison. His arrest was kept as quiet as possible, as his lieutenants were also rounded up for fear of reprisal. By December of 1953, it was announced that Beria, alongside 6 other accomplices, had conspired over many years to seize power in the Soviet Union and restore capitalism under encouragement from foreign intelligence. This is not true as far as we know, but Beria was simply seen as too deranged, too calculated, and too dangerous to be allowed to potentially seize power for himself. So they needed an excuse to get rid of him, the same excuse that Beria himself had used to justify the deaths of so many others. He was an enemy of the state. A sham tribunal was set up, as was the Soviet way, and Beria and his accused colleagues had no representation and no appeal. According to General Moskalenko, when Beria actually heard that he was going to be put to death, he fell to the floor and begged on his knees for mercy. He was, of course, afforded no such kindness, just as he had denied it to everyone who had died by his hand. And so, at the age of 54 in December of 1953, Lavrentiy Beria would be shot in the head and killed, executed by the same state that he had ravaged and terrorized for years. Even a shampoo and rinse with a bullet is regarded as more mercy than Beria deserved, considering the incredible levels of suffering he'd caused for so many and for so long. Well, at least, that's the official story. Beria's son and wife were sent to a Siberian labor camp, but his son would later argue that the father was not executed in December, but June, shortly after being arrested. He posits that the regime just wanted him gone, and they set up everything later with the trial with a look-alike in order to imitate some kind of legal justification. Although it must be said that this version of events is disputed, and Beria's son is very complimentary of his father, despite the kind of person that he was, making him a somewhat unreliable narrator. But as for Beria himself, the legacy that he left, whilst a relatively unknown one today, was deeply embedded in the minds of those who lived through Stalin's purges. Even Stalin himself was buried in Lenin's mausoleum and later moved to a grave nearby the Kremlin's walls. But people didn't want to just kill Beria, they wanted to erase him. So his body was burned and his ashes were scattered into the wind. For decades after the fact, any mention of Beria was completely expunged from the official Soviet histories. People wanted to put this monster back under the bed where it belonged. But of course, they couldn't. The genie was out of the bottle. People would never forget about his notorious reputation for cruelty, at least in living memory. How could they? But the more important point is that we shouldn't forget. Grim as the memories may be, hard as the Soviets tried to expunge them, they are an eternal reminder of the dangers of sycophants, paranoia, and unchecked power.